Everybody. It is really a great pleasure to be here. It's great to see so many people who really took the time out to listen to a talk about Turkish gangsters. Usually it's only my family that would kind of be the ones that to sit down and take a moment. So I really do appreciate your time. Rather than a joke, I want to break the ice by telling a very brief anecdote, an important one, an illustrative one, but I think one that I've always sort of found, funny and interesting. Now, I think probably like many of you in this room, I am a tremendous fan of The Godfather. I've seen it countless times, and one of my hobbies is collecting stories of Hollywood lore, and there are many very famous stories about the making of The Godfather. Okay, it was a tumultuous project. And who you see before you are the principal, sort of fathers of the Godfather project. It's Mario Puzo, who wrote The Godfather, Francis Ford Coppola, obviously the director, and Bob Evans, who was the principal producer of the project. Now, again, there are many stories. I could tell all of them if we actually had the time and if you had the patience, but I'm not going to. But I want to tell one that I think is an interesting, sort of comment on not just the project itself, The Godfather, but really the genre and the reason why I've done this project itself that I'm going to talk about today. And that is a story related to the pitch of The Godfather. Now, Puzo wrote the book. It was a bestseller. But interestingly enough, Hollywood really was not in the business of making gangster movies in the early 1970s. Gangster movies were really passé. But this was a big hit, and Bob Evans, who was one of the main creative minds behind Paramount Pictures, jumped on the idea of making this movie. And they picked Coppola to direct it. Now, Francis Ford Coppola I think he had directed one movie that was not all that successful. He had done some writing, but he had nothing like the credentials that he would eventually acquire. And he had a really sort of awful reputation of being sort of an enfant terrible of Hollywood, very opinionated, young, and also very much in tune with the counterculture of the late 1960s. So it was a sort of a risky proposition that he was going to direct this movie that Paramount really staked a great deal behind, because Paramount was really in trouble in the early 1970s. And so, as many of you may know, Coppola originally did not want to do the project. He thought it was actually insulting to his Italian-American ancestry. But he took the project, he took on the script, and then he went to Bob Evans, and Bob Evans has a legendary career in Hollywood. And he said to Evans, I have an idea for the project. It's going to be a treatise on American capitalism. And Bob Evans, the verbatim is probably, I don't want to insult mixed company. So, he was apoplectic. He's like, American capitalism. And so this tirade, expletive-ridden tirade then, came out of him. Like, this is insane. This is Hollywood, for God's sake. And they went back and forth over this idea of the project of what The Godfather is supposed to be. But anyway, long story short, they do make it, and it's bigger than anything. The Godfather it wins Academy Awards. The Godfather 2 wins Academy Awards. It redefines a genre that had been at the core of American cinema in the early part of the century. Now, I've always found this anecdote somewhat funny for this reason. Bob Evans should know better than to question the idea of using The Godfather as a metaphor, particularly a metaphor for American culture, American politics, let alone American economy. Because if you watch any of the great gangster movies of the 30s, and I would challenge you to try to not find a movie or a TV series that now conforms to this model as well. It's hard to find a gangster movie, any kind of work, that isn't a reflection on American culture, that isn't a reflection on a way of trying to ponder, a question, and really tackle difficult questions regarding American economic life, class, identity, and so on. Gangster stories are important metaphors for how Americans now think about their culture, okay? It is a standard, it is a bedrock concept in popular culture, okay, our popular culture. Now, I've always been a fan of the genre. This was a project that I had developed even as I was sort of a graduate student. I was always taken with the idea of trying to study the origins of organized crime in Turkey, a country that I was not born in, I have no family there, but a place I really came to love. And I was particularly taken by the fact that no one had really ever seriously written about this, even though it is similarly a trope that by the time, I'm sorry, Linda, go right ahead. It is a trope that is really dominant within popular Turkish culture, particularly in the early 20th century, in the 21st century. And so I wrote this book. And what I want to sort of spend the rest of my time today talking about is some of the basic sort of conceptual or theoretical principles that help me think about this project, some of the core conclusions and questions that sort of I wrestled with in doing the project, and talk a little bit about how what I really think history of gangsters teaches us, or can perhaps open our eyes to a bit more clearly regarding Turkey. And I think, just generally speaking, as a topic, as a prism through which we can understand, history and contemporary society in lots of places all over the world, including our own country. Okay. So anyway, I wrote this book. I published this book last year. It's essentially a history of how a commodity, an illegal commodity, something that is at the core of an organized crime, an organized criminal enterprise, heroin, how it has helped shape the evolution of the country, right? And this should be, for any of you who are, at all sort of familiar with the drug trade, the history of the drug trade, this shouldn't perhaps come as too much of a surprise. Heroin is a major commodity in the global marketplace today. And it is trafficked through Turkey rather prominently. It is a commodity that in fact was for a very long time produced in really large illicit quantities, going back to the pre-Second World War and even pre-First World War era. It is a commodity that in fact remains in production in Turkey as a legal commodity used for medical purposes all over the world. Okay, so it plays a major role in the country's economic and in turn political development. Organized crime is an important outgrowth. And when I use the term organized crime in this respect, I mean the people who actually do the crime, members of organized crime, gangsters. They have become visible actors in the making of this country, the making of contemporary politics. And so the idea of this book was to try to understand the ways in which the country has been shaped by both trying to combat this trade and the way those traders have also influenced and sometimes cooperated with the making of that with the making of contemporary politics, society, and economy. And then also to highlight the very important role of the United States in this process. The United States is a very visible component, a very visible and very vital contributor to the making of modern Turkish politics, economy, and society. And in this respect, we see the role of Americans very vividly and quite impactfully. I'll return to sort of other conclusions drawn from the book a bit later. But what I want to take some time to sort of walk through with you right now is sort of the general kind of points of departure, intellectual points of departure for the project, right? I don't want to belabor these points too much, okay? But I do want to emphasize that the lessons that I attempt to draw from this project go beyond Turkey, okay? And they are applicable elsewhere. And one of the reasons for this is that the principal focal point of this project is the making of the Turkish state, the state itself. Now, there's a great deal that is written in theoretical terms on the history of statehood, statecraft. And one of the basic points of departure I begin with in this book is what the state is supposed to do. What is it conceptually entailed? Is its construction supposed to accomplish? And what is its relationship to those who the state governs? Okay. Now, many of you, particularly graduate students in this room, are probably, and professors, are undoubtedly familiar with the work of Charles Tilly, and particularly this very famous article he wrote on war making and state making as organized crime. Now, I do not put this forward as a way of being somehow smarmy or cynical about what governance or politics is. I do not see necessarily a government or a governor as the moral equivalent of Don Corleone sipping cappuccino and reigning over populations like a mafia don. The metaphor, rather, to me, is an important one in terms of understanding how, like some organized crime groups, a state forges a relationship with the society. The state extracts what the formal term rents, or the sort of academic term rents, money, service, loyalty, commodities, resources from its population in exchange for protection, right? This protection is both real. Government is the primary force by which a country is protected from outside invaders, it's protected from the elements and so on, but also imaginary threats. Because again, to draw the analogy of a mobster, flipping a coin and going by a lonesome shopkeeper saying, I'd hate to see anything terrible happen to you. If you give me a few dollars every week, I'll make sure your plate glass window stays in place. That is a hypothetical or imaginary threat that is really one that is more fomented by the person purporting to protect you. In this case, governments do these sorts of things. Now, I don't want to take this analogy too much further, because what really interests me is the idea that in its beginnings, a state, the conceit of a state resides in its ability. It's as the sole protector of people and the sole definer of what security is and what the rules are of between those who are governed and those who are governing. Okay. Now, moving beyond this into what governance means beyond this fundamental issue. The other formal point of departure, point of agreement, is the idea that when we think about modern statecraft, it's more than this kind of cash and carry business of protection for resources or rents or taxes or whatnot. A state endows itself with the legitimacy to reform society, manage economy, make society, economy, politics conform to an ideal state in which society is rational. It acts in predictable ways. The economy functions at a level that is productive and that is, conceivably always growing, always prosperous. Okay? These are the standards by which we expect governments to act. Now, this drive, and it's a pathological drive that are possessed by all governments, is a highly invasive one. Okay? Now, the idea is that that governments should know no bounds in managing society, managing its norms, social norms, its economic norms, its political norms, there should be, states should even act in concert with other states along similar lines, economic lines, social lines, political lines, in conjunction with one another. Okay? The very idea of international law is premised on the idea that states share similar interests, they function in similar ways, and they are willing to work cooperatively together for a common good. And this common good would mirror the common good of that of a state, that society would behave in rational, predictable, conformist sorts of ways, that, that the growth of wealth, the growth of economic productivity would continue unhindered and would continue positively in perpetuity. Now, what does this have to do with crime, particularly organized crime? Well, organized crime fundamentally represents a rejection of all these things. Organized crime represents, both as a trade as well as the people who perform crimes, outliers and resistors to this drive towards law and order, conformity, greater state intervention and management over societal affairs. And the first examples of this kind of nonconformist, resisting sort of behavior is in the form of banditry. Now, for those of you who are not historians, for those of you who are perhaps new to the study of crime, banditry is a sort of form of organized crime. Okay? Banditry as a phenomenon is a global one, and it's one that plagues every state, big and small, weak and powerful, from literally the moment there are states. Okay? Now, banditry is a kind of shifting variable. It's not what banditry really is. It's actually a matter of debate. It sort of, though, has this quality of a duck. You sort of know it when you see it. On the other hand, the idea of banditry as a political problem is one that does have a certain trajectory in history. Okay? A finite one, actually. Now, banditry was among the first manifestations in global political cultures that demonstrated the inability of states to exert its will on its population, its inability to extract without limit or without hindrance from its population. Why? Because bandits are doing that. They are extracting in place of governments. So what we see through the history of any state, and this is particularly the case of pre-modern states, states before the Industrial Revolution, what we see is the case of bandits as the focal point of states' the drive of states, the will to states to expand its influence, to combat what they see as the prime example of lawlessness, disorder, economic disenfranchisement, economic disorder. Now, to combat it, however, the realities of combating this crime is not simply one of cops and robbers. It's not simply a matter of throwing people in jail. In the long term, the story of organized crime is one of both suppression and co-option. Suppression is the conventional way, the way one would usually speak. When somebody commits a crime, particularly a crime like banditry, they're thrown in prison, they're killed, they're snuffed out. In more cases than not, what you see throughout history is the will of states to actually try to incorporate bandits into the working of governments. Bandits become soldiers. Bandits become policemen. Bandits become governors. Bandits become kings. So this is not simply a case of it being a marginal problem, or that these are simply marginal actors. In fact, bandits have the potential to becoming very impactful political, economic, and social actors. But like I said, banditry has a finite history in the history of the world, generally speaking. By the time we get to the 20th century, by the time industrialization is in full flight the world over, banditry increasingly becomes a rare phenomenon, right? Any of you here can leave Tucson, get in your car, drive into the woods, and be fairly confident no one is going to hold you up on the side of the road. The idea that you can travel virtually anywhere with unfettered access, with absolute confidence that your safety, your security is assured, is a feature of the fact that modern government has suppressed virtually every portion of society, of the countryside, has extended its rule, has extended over what we would consider good governance virtually everywhere, right? Whereas in the past, our forefathers, whether they were rich or poor, king or peasant, would have dreaded the idea of going into a forest or to some distant, dark portion of the countryside. Because of roads, because of telegraph lines, because of post offices, because of police stations, because of schoolhouses. The idea that there is some remote or distant or wayward place on the map that would somehow be the heart, the kind of the nesting ground of people like bandits, that now no longer exists, at least not exists in the sense that it used to, okay? Now, ironically enough, as I sat down to write this book, one would be surprised to find how little there is written about the history, like a serious academic history of organized crime, modern day organized crime, your Al Capones, your Pablo Escobars, this sort of organized crime that we would typically think of when we think of organized crime. Really doesn't exist quite yet, at least not in history. Now, when I sat down to write this, in some ways I had come to this point where, I came to the question of, if we now live in a world where banditry doesn't exist, but organized crime exists as we know it, seemingly everywhere, and particularly in places that is not the countryside, but in town, how is it then that it does exist? And particularly, how does it exist in places where we typically think of governance being strongest, in town, in cities, right? So, fundamentally, this is what the book tries to accomplish, tries to answer this question, okay? Now, I'm going to give you a spoiler, okay? What I feel is the fundamental reason for why, in historical terms, there is not just this thing called organized crime, but why it actually exists to such a degree that it has such a profound impact over the making of modern politics, economies, and society, is that it, like banditry, still underscores the inability of states to fulfill fundamental, the fundamental promises of statecraft, okay? Organized crime, in and of itself, represents lawlessness, and to fight organized crime is to combat lawlessness, okay? Organized crime respects the degree to which societies, modern states, still have trouble managing what they feel is good societal behavior. It still is fundamentally represents the inability of states to extract rents, again, resources, taxes, loyalties, good commodities even, from the population. And it fundamentally represents an increasing turn in modern statecraft for states to want to root out aspects of society that it feels is undesirable. root it out or at least mitigate it, nullify it. Groups like minorities, immigrants, and so forth. Okay? Now, organized crime endures because it is fundamentally the modern Frankenstein monster of governance. Okay? It is a byproduct of the fact that governments create an unreal standard and they create unreal laws that it cannot fulfill. The idea, for example, in the case of something like drug trafficking, the conceit that a government can will its entire population not to do drugs and not buy them and not grow them and not sell them, right? That is an unreal expectation. It flourishes because it is something that is unsuppressible, okay? The conceit that it could be controlled, right, creates the problem unto itself, okay? Now, more to that point, while the governments may be successful in suppressing it, in some places, there are places in modern day society, there are pockets of contemporary states which are still by design or by some default, the result of are pockets of weakness or pockets of ungoverned space. They may be ghettos. They may be border regions. They may be still pockets in the woods. Think, for example, I don't know what would be the equivalent in Arizona. Maybe it's Tucson. Northern California marijuana plantations. These are still, there are areas of the country that are still isolated enough, lonesome enough, inaccessible enough, where these kinds of activities can still flourish. Now, with this, sort of these points of contention, one thing that I try to emphasize in the book in trying to tell the story of organized crime in Turkey is to emphasize the fact that modern day governance both represents an act of trying to suppress, or does entail attempts to suppress organized criminal activity, as well as at the same time it helps enable it, right? Now, of the thing that makes organized crime so visible and durable in contemporary society, and this would be and one aspect of this, we certainly see it in matters of drug trafficking, is policing itself. Now, when we think of policing, we think of it as the ultimate bare-knuckled act of trying to suppress something. But what happens when you have a crime, and drug trafficking is among these kinds of crimes, where there really is no victim, where there's somebody not going to call the cops and say, please help stop me, I'm about to buy a kilo of Coke. That situation does not materialize. So in a case where people are committing acts that neither party is really willing to volunteer that the criminal act is being committed, how do you police such a thing? Well, the long story short is, and this is very much the case of Turkey, and it's one of the reasons why organized crime is so visible in Turkey, and arguably very visible in other countries as well, is that one has to partner with organized crime to make those cases. The very best informants are the criminals themselves. And so I could go on into this case into greater detail if you like, question and answer with examples, but essentially what we see in the case of Turkey is that major criminal offenders are among those who are the most responsible for suppressing the trade. Okay. Now, more parochially, major offenders, major perpetrators of organized crime are fundamentally citizens who are able to fundraise, produce, mobilize in societies. And this is typically the case of organized, of figures with an organized crime who are wealthy. Organized criminals give money whether they're bribes, or whether they build a house for somebody, or whether they build a theater, which is the case, for example, of several major heroin traffickers from the 1950s and 60s in Turkey. They built theaters, they built schools, they built mosques. These were people who were people of note, and they were contributors to the way a society works. And we see this even with the evolution of Turkey becoming from being a fairly closed system, a highly oligarchical and undemocratic system, to being a system which is increasingly more liberal and more open. And then lastly, what undoubtedly captures most people's attention is the degree to which members of organized crime participate in extrajudicial activities or policies that are undertaken by states. The killing of peoples, spying of peoples who are deemed, again, politically undesirable or political enemies. Now, when we see through the development of not just intelligence apparati, but fundamentally through the policing systems created in Turkey, but also in other parts of the world, gangsters become political allies. And they become political allies particularly when members of governments wish to do things that are illegal, particularly things that are violent. Okay. Now, the other aspect of this story in the case of Turkey is to think about this phenomenon not as one that exists in space. Okay? The idea of organized crime does not exist unto itself as as an original concept. It's actually a very American one. The term organized crime did not exist before the 1890s. It is a term that is invented in the United States, and it's a term invented by American reformers. It is a term, it's a concept, and in fact, it's a structure, a policing concept that is universalized through the expansion of American influence worldwide, in particular, the expansion of American law enforcement, the adoption of American law enforcement efforts worldwide, particularly after the Second World War. Now, this takes on many different elements, but in particular, when we talk about the case of Turkey, when we talk about the case of the United States or many other countries around the world, we lend to organized crime certain qualities that particularly mirror certain qualities that are undesirable or marginal or minority within larger societies. Okay? We often give organized crime an ethnic flavoring, right? Russian organized crime, Turkish organized crime. That conceptually is very much an American one. And it's one that has become very much a feature of how organized crime is policed now everywhere, including Turkey. Now, what's very funny about this story, and unfortunately this is one that I only limitedly explore in the book, is that this is not simply a top-down process of defining what a culture is, organized crime as a culture is, or even the idea that organized crime should or does play a prominent political role or economic role or social role within various countries. It actually is it could be more characterized as a reverberation loop. Okay, and I'll illustrate it with this very brief anecdote. Does anybody know who this is? You're failing the mafia test. This is Bugsy Siegel. This is one of the founders of Las Vegas, right? New York gangster who moves to Los Angeles and into Las Vegas in the early mid 1940s. Anybody know who this is? This guy? No? Okay, you're failing. Okay, I'll recommend some movies when we're done. This is George Raft. George Raft played opposite to Paul Muni in the 1932 version of Scarface. Many of you have seen the Al Pacino version. The Al Pacino version is based on this 1932 movie. And he plays, iconically enough, Muggsy. And Muggsy, really more than any other sort of almost, rivaling almost any other caricature of a gangster, he really was became the picture of what a gangster would look like in, sort of the wartime era, the fedora, the suit, the sharp look, but also the flipping of the coin. If anybody who's ever seen a Bugs Bunny cartoon where you'd ever see the gangster and he's always flipping a coin, that is a George Raft embellishment from Scarface. Now, there's a very famous story that George Raft became very popular in the American underworld after Scarface. He was, he was a celebrity. And there's a very famous story about him meeting Bugsy Siegel. And Bugsy Siegel said, God, where did you come up with that the flipping of the coin thing? I've never seen that. And George Raft said, well, I thought that's something you would do. Now, jump to the late 30s, early 40s. This man, who's far more obscure, Harry Anslinger, who's the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, began to get involved in the production of Hollywood movies on drug trafficking and organized crime. He is the famous he's the brain father, not brainchild, but the brain, I guess, behind Reefer Madness. If any of you have ever seen Reefer Madness. He also did input on other sort of not so B-rated movies, B+, really, movies about gangsters, in which he drew very heavily from the image that was generated by the movies of the 1930s. Okay? So eventually, the kind of images that we have of organized crime that begin in between this ether of fiction and reality eventually gets projected back by government. Now, I say all this with a certain proviso. Okay, that when one writes a history of organized crime, there really is no truth. Okay, it is a history that, unlike most histories, is never really one supposed to be told. Those who both perpetrate the crime as well as those who police it have plenty of reason to lie. And there are many elements of the story that simply are unverifiable or may never actually be revealed or come to light. And even if it did, how would you know whether or not to believe it? Now, with all that said, I want to close by just talking about some of the basic elements of how these sorts of broader sort of intellectual conclusions shape the country of Turkey, since many of you here, this is the reason why you're here. Now, the first thing I would argue is that organized crime as trade is fundamental to the way in which Turkey evolves from an empire, a part of an empire, into a nation state. The act of smuggling, the act of producing and trading things on an illicit level is something that endures from the very end of empire to the present day liberal republic. In fact, it's not only is it a constant, it's something that evolves along the lines of Turkey's own economic path. From its beginning at the end of the Ottoman Empire, from the end of the Ottoman Empire as a modernizing, reforming state to a state that is with an economic agenda that is nationalizing, highly statist in both its architecture as well as its conception, to its increasingly liberalized, increasingly open, more importantly, increasingly urbanized and internationalized state that it is today, its highly commercialized state that it is today. To understand the development of a trade like heroin, but one could produce, sort of look at other sort of illicitly produced products traded in Turkey as well, we see this trajectory very well. One thing that organized crime emphasizes in the development of Turkey. In fact, I think it does so better than many other aspects in which people have looked at Turkey, is that we see the complex social nature of Turkey on an ethnic level. And this is something that, frankly, is both a caricature and a reality. Okay? When one thinks about the development of organized crime groups in Turkey, one's thoughts tend to look at immigrant groups that populate different portions of the country, in particular major cities. specifically groups from the northeast of the country, so-called Lazistan, the Laz, although not necessarily ethnically Laz, people from the northeast of the country, people from the southeast of the country, predominantly Kurds, as well as immigrants from the Southern Balkans. These are often, the backgrounds of prominent gangsters that we see discussed in newspapers and in books and in police reports in Turkey. While this certainly does conform to the way in which many people typically think about organized crime around the world as being a minority, as being an immigrant phenomenon, it actually does also reflect the certain elements of reality within Turkey's evolution, social evolution, specifically in its cities. Okay? Now, I think when one looks at the Turkish state as a whole, and again, this is a conclusion one could draw about virtually any state, organized crime as a phenomenon highlights the reality of Turkey as being a strong state, a state that is highly centralized, with a very strong security apparatus. Now that is in part true, and in fact, while one could be very cynical about the strength in which organized crime and people associated with organized crime operate within the Turkish political system, Turkey is actually a far healthier society than many others. In fact, when it comes to policing, Turkey in the 21st century is actually a role model for how organized crime is policed. And I see some smirks. This is not me talking. This is how I've heard people say it. And I would be happy to go into that in greater discussion later. But in any case, I mean, one thing that it's the ongoing durability of organized crime as a phenomenon in Turkey emphasizes the degree that the Turkish state is not as strong as it pretends to be. Now, lastly, I want to talk about how Turkey, I would emphasize that Turkey is a country where organized crime has served as a means for the kind of what you could call it upward mobility, or at the very least sort of an economic means to both participate directly in government activity, government policy, both in terms of developing policy as well as executing it, as well as opposing it. Okay? The heroin trade is the lifeblood of various groups in Turkey that have been highly supportive of certain Turkish, policies, or has been, more, let's just say, provided, sort of centered itself as an ally to government. The most recent and probably recognizable example of this, at least for people who are familiar with contemporary affairs in Turkey, would be an individual like Sedat Peker. Sedat Peker, famous gangster from the 1990s, has again reemerged as a powerful nationalist voice in Turkey. And one could not forget a group like the PKK, which as a group was born out of a region where illicit trades is the lifeblood of local economic activity. Without it, the PKK probably would not have been born in the late 1970s. It was that trade that helped finance and mobilize among the very first expressions of the PKK. And the last but not least, I want to talk about the United States. I want to say a few words about the United States. Trying to tell the story of organized crime in Turkey without the United States would not be possible. American police officers, American diplomats, American army officers, American theorists have had an indelible impact upon how Turkish law enforcement have approached the issue of organized crime. It is arguably even as a result of American culture that that Turks have begun to think about organized crime even as a phenomenon. Before The Godfather, and here I'll stop, there was no term for a mafia boss in the way in which one would think about it today. Now, there were sort of similar figures that one would now associate with mafia groups, mafia bosses. These are the famous or infamous kabadaya, the sort of neighborhood toughs, or neighborhood leaders that you would see in working class areas. But the term baba, which is generally referenced as a kind of godfather figure, is the Turkish translation for the title of the Godfather. It comes into parlance in 1972 when it's released in Turkey for the first time. Now, I realize that I've meandered my way through a lot of material. I really want to thank you for your attention. I really want to thank you for this opportunity to talk about this today. Thank you.